we shouldn't approach the subject of spirituality from the point of view of a Christian, Muslim, scientist, or atheist, but rather from an independent starting point. Now, this doesn't mean we're not allowed to think or form opinions for ourselves. It just means let go of bias. Whenever we have our own horse in the race, so to speak, there tends to be inherent bias. And this bias can prevent us from seeing truth on all sides of an issue. And in fact, I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face as a society today, this inability to see truth due to preformed biases. We have to remember that truth only comes to those who are willing to be independent. So we have to be independent observers, so to speak, analogous to the scientific method. This analogy shouldn't come as a surprise, as we'll make the argument later on, that science and spirituality are actually two sides to the same coin. So why are we talking about weird, esoteric stuff like spirituality? We live in a world of smartphones, tablets, social media, on-demand TV. So why bother with something so seemingly archaic and antiquated as religion? Something that seemingly goes against the grain of rationality and science. Why not just focus on the world in front of us, live our lives, and just get along with one another? Why bother with all this spirituality nonsense? What I've seen in my experience, and some of you may agree, is that religion in the traditional sense of the term seems to be in decline. And not just one religion, but pretty much all religions across the board. Now, if we look deeper at this and ask ourselves what's going on, in many cases, and we alluded to this earlier, it comes down to the issue of doubt. Every religion has its own narrative about God, man, and the world around us. And oftentimes people find it difficult to reconcile this narrative with science, intellect, or their own personal experience. A person might have, for example, a close family member die, like a spouse, son, or daughter, and they wonder, how could this happen? They live such good lives and were such good people, so how can a benevolent God allow such a tragedy? So you have this dilemma of how much should I trust this narrative put forth by religion versus just going with what I think makes sense on my own. Faith versus reason, if you will. Now, this is an issue, faith versus reason, that in Western civilization goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, with figures like Anselm and Aquinas, and resurfaces again several times throughout the course of history, including during the Scientific Revolution and Enlightenment. But even if you look at the present, look at the generation before us and compare that to now. The role of religion has changed dramatically in just one generation. A lot of this probably has to do with the rise in technology with the smartphones and tablets, and just the fast-paced nature of our lives in general. Most of us simply don't have time to think about esoteric things like religion. If we look at the number of atheists and agnostics, I'm not sure if they're a majority or not these days, but they certainly make up a large proportion, especially among millennials. And in fact, I would argue that out of all the groups, agnostics are probably the most genuine, if you think about it. You have the believers on one hand who may say adamantly there is a God, and the non-believers who may say adamantly there is no God. Well, how do these groups know whether there is or isn't a God? Have they actually seen it? Do they have proof one way or another? Agnostics acknowledge they don't know if God exists. They reserve judgment and claim neither belief nor disbelief, which seems reasonable. Until you have proof, how can you be sure? If we consider atheists, most view religion as pure superstition created to keep man in line. They say it's irrelevant in a modern world, goes against rationality and common sense, something that leads to more harm than good for the world. Looking back at the history of civilization on this planet, at the number of wars and bloodshed committed in the name of religion, and nowadays at the number of terrorist attacks and suicide bombings, it's hard to argue against the atheists. Maybe they have a point. Then there's another group below atheists who identify with their particular religion in name only, as a token gesture to acknowledge their cultural or social identity. They say, I consider myself Jewish, for example, because that's what everyone in my family is. That's what my ancestors were. So I go to the synagogues and check the box on the surveys next to Jewish, but don't really buy into it. And then, of course, you have the group who say they're spiritual but not religious. When you ask people what they mean by that, spiritual but not religious, many find it difficult to explain. Some say they prefer to think about these things more on an individual level rather than being part of an organized religion that prescribes you to think a certain way. In other words, they don't like the restrictions that organized religion places on them and prefer to be allowed to think for themselves. They haven't gone completely away from religion to become atheists. They're still calling themselves spiritual. They just want it on their own terms. Which kind of makes sense, right? You don't want to be told what to believe. You want to be able to think about something for yourself, decide if it makes sense, and then make a decision. People in the modern world don't like to be told things, whether it's religion, politics, how to raise their kids, whatever. They don't like the idea of having to swallow something that goes against their own intuition, which seems like a reasonable objection. If anyone says something that goes against your own common sense and logic, reject it immediately. This is sort of our own inbuilt defense mechanism, this ability to reason. So just reject it. Don't believe it until you see it for yourself. We don't achieve knowledge through being spoon-fed, right? In any field or subject. Does a medical student learn surgery by memorizing a textbook? Does a teenager learn to drive by watching a video? Oh, right, they actually have to perform a few surgeries and drive on their own a few times before they get it. If I tell a colorblind person the sky is blue, do they really know, or do they just take my word for it? Even if they take my word for it, do they know what shade of blue it is? Light blue, navy blue, dark blue? They can only know for sure if they see it themselves.